A very warm welcome. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening. This is a webinar on guidance on avoided emissions. We are getting started. We are opening our virtual doors for this virtual launch event. A pleasure seeing many of you who have an interest of finding out what avoided emissions is, why we have been dealing with this over the past year, and what the guidance is that you can find from now on our internet. We are going to post a link soon. My name is Alexander Nick. I'm the Director of Climate Action at WBCSD. For those of you who don't know us yet, we are the World Business Council for Sustainable Development. We work with around 220 multinational companies on their sustainability transformation. We focus on addressing the climate crisis, on restoring nature, on tackling inequality. We are here today joined together with the Net Zero Initiative, who is managed by Carbone 4, a consultancy, and the Net Zero Initiative develops ambitious action frameworks for companies that wish to contribute to achieving a global net zero. With this webinar today, we provide you an overview on the guidance on avoided emissions. This is our contribution to develop a common understanding and much more guidance that is out there right now on this topic of avoided emissions, what it is, how we define it, how it can be calculated, and also how to leverage avoided emissions to support and to drive climate-aligned decision-making, innovation, and purpose definition. Please ask questions throughout the webinar. We have scheduled it for a short period of time, so we will all be short and sweet in our statements, and I have the responsibility to ensure that we are finishing by in 45 minutes. Our experts will answer as many questions as possible that you have throughout the webinar, but you also have the opportunity to ask further questions afterwards. On the next slide, you will see the range of speakers that are with you today. So we do have an advisory council, and I welcome Pernilla Bergmark and Gregory Norris to our session today. So they helped us throughout this process. We will hear from Kihara-san later on today, who is the Deputy Director General of the Ministry of Economy, Trade and Industry from the government of Japan. I also welcome Tony Rook, who is the Executive Director and the Head of Transition Finance at GFANZ, the Glasgow Financial Alliance for Net Zero. I'm pleased to also welcome our own Dominic Roray, our Executive VP at WBCSD, as well as our team who have been working on it with Cecilia Valerie and Diane Bouzer on our side, as well as César Dugas on the Carbone 4 side. So there's a lot to cover. Let's move on to the next slide to show you how we are scheduling this webinar. And here, for the first time, you can see the cover page of our guidance. Please dive into it, give us feedback. There are around 60 pages you can consume, you can digest and see if it hopefully helps in your ambitions driving decarbonization further towards a global net zero. The agenda reads as following. It will be opened by Dominic by providing some overriding perspective on why we have been addressing avoided emissions. We are then going to provide you an overview of what is in the guidance. Thirdly, the two members of our advisory board will provide some reflections. And then in the last section, we will look on how avoided emissions, the concept and the calculations and the benefits could eventually be explored and leveraged in finance as well as in policy. This is where we are. This is what we are doing. Welcome again to this webinar. And I'm now handing over to Dominic. Dominic, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Alex. And thank you everyone for joining us for the launch of the WBCSD Avoided Emissions Guidance. I'm delighted and honoured that so many of you have joined us in the launch of our avoided emissions guidance. It's great to see so many people kind of dialing in for a virtual event, and the fact that these guidelines have generated so much interest around the world tells us all that it's a very important topic in today's climate agenda. I believe this is because we're entering quite a new phase in the transition to net zero, which will focus not only on how companies can be held accountable for their own emissions, but also on how all institutions can collaborate to define the most efficient and effective ways to achieve our global net zero goal. Many of you probably saw the IPCC report that was released earlier this week. And if there's one key message from that, it's that change needs to begin to happen immediately if we're to have a chance of limiting the global temperature rise. And yet, for this change to be successful, companies as well as government and financial actors must have access to tools that adequately inform how the decisions they make today will impact our ability to successfully achieve net zero tomorrow. And for that purpose, regulators have recently and rightly placed a strong emphasis on accountability and the need for companies to set science-informed targets for their value chain emissions. You know well the greenhouse gas protocol, you know well issues like scope 1 and scope 2 and scope 3, and these dimensions are reflected, for instance, in the International Sustainability Standards Board's unanimous decision to require companies to disclose scope 3 emissions, and in the EU's Corporate Sustainability Reporting Directive, which requires companies to disclose their 1.5 degrees Celsius aligned transition plans. So this is all very, very important activity. But what about the contribution that the company makes via its solutions? For example, I might be a company that has gone through the process of accounting very effectively for my own emissions of entry, my scope 1, my scope 2, my scope 3. I've established a science-based target. I've defined a transition plan. I'm disclosing on my progress. But I have also chosen to shift my own business model to manufacture low or zero emission, for example, air conditioning units. I have chosen to not make diesel air conditioning units, but PV, zero emission air conditioning units. So where's the recognition of that contribution towards my business that is avoiding future emissions? And how do we accurately account for that contribution? And how do we encourage more companies to also shift their business models in similar directions, rather than focusing only on the climate challenge as an issue about compliance or risk management, about only reducing one's own inventory of emissions? This is important because we will not get to net zero by 2050, and certainly not to the required 45% reduction by 2030, if companies are only encouraged to reduce their emissions instead of also transforming into low and zero emission solutions providers. So we need some kind of guidance, some kind of framework, some kind of incentive model to shift business thinking on greenhouse gas emissions away from mostly a compliance and risk management agenda to both a compliance and an innovation-driven agenda. And this is exactly why the World Business Council for Sustainable Development and its member companies, in collaboration with the Net Zero Initiative and an expert advisory group, set out to define a framework to consistently assess and account for decarbonisation impact of company solutions, also known as avoided emissions. Because although the term avoided emissions is not new, no global guidelines have to date been established to ensure the credibility of claims made by companies about the sustainability of the products that are exponentially occupying our store shelves. If we don't have such a high bar set of guidelines on what avoided emissions are, we run the risk of greenwashing. So, as both a global business membership-based organization and co-convener of the Greenhouse Gas Protocol, the World Business Council for Sustainable Development has long recognized the critical need for consistency and standardization in frameworks to drive forward credible decarbonization strategy. Guide in place for avoided emissions, anyone, quite frankly, could make avoided emissions claims without any consistency or credibility. So we absolutely need a strong and clear set of principles, a framework to understand what counts and what doesn't count for avoided emissions. quite frankly, as I mentioned, what is greenwashing and what is not greenwashing. So our focus is to ensure high integrity, because it's important that we set the bar high for what a framework for avoided emissions should look like. And if we get this right, we will achieve 3 big breakthroughs. Number 1, we will be able to stimulate a lot of innovation, because there will be an accounting concept for the impact on society beyond a company just reducing its own emissions. It becomes less about compliance and equally the same, if not more, about opportunity. Much more of a prize to win, as well as a risk to manage. We will also offer the potential for a profound policy unlock, as policymakers and investors will be able to leverage a recognized high bar that could direct public policy and investment towards incentivizing companies to shift their business models and ensure green solutions are pulled into the markets most in need of them. And thirdly, it will increase accountability and demonstrate companies' contributions to global net zero. Again, going beyond compliance and risk management alone and towards a partnership with multiple other businesses and governments working together to innovate new products and services and push them into the markets where they are most required, perhaps linked to nationally determined contributions, and to accelerate the overall shift to the net zero transition. This is the potential that the framework and the guidance for avoided emission holds. So I'd like to finish by inviting all the actors on this launch call and those others who will use this guidance to leverage the avoided emissions potential to encourage, incentivize, and support the critical decisions that will need to be made to supercharge the global shift to net zero in the coming years. Thank you very much. And Alex, back to you.
Thank you very much, Dominic. I think you said it loud and clear. This guidance is aimed to support companies, to enable companies to unlock further additional low carbon 1.5 aligned products and services while setting a high bar on how they can claim and innovate. And now we are going into the overview of the guidance. A huge thanks first at all, if we go to the next slide. So you see the authors of the guidance. Again, you have been working relentlessly over the past year together with our WBCSD member companies contributing to it, as well as our advisory board. So a huge thanks to bringing us where we are. We know, and Dominic said it, it is a contested area, so it is not easy to find a way forward. And now over to you to walk us through on a high level what this guidance entails. Cecilia, please take us away.
Thank you very much, Alex, and thank you, Dominic, for the introduction. As introduced by Dominic, the whole premise behind avoided emissions and this guidance is to give companies the tools that they need to move beyond just reducing their emissions, which is, of course, considered essential, and it's exactly what the science is requiring of them, but to also understand how they can transform their business to become solution providers and to really become the solution providers that develop and scale the solutions that are needed to decarbonize society. And the reason we believe that avoided emissions is essential for this contextual or this additional contribution is that they provide this contextual feature that allows companies to understand where they need to place these solutions in order to have the highest decarbonizing impact. And to reflect this, let me put an example. If you're a PV manufacturer and you're you're deploying your PV panels in a country that's already running on 100% renewable energy, you're not going to have the same impact as if you're a solar PV manufacturer that's actually deploying these in a country that's running almost exclusively on fossil fuel-based energy. So here you see how avoided emissions can really highlight where the solutions need to be deployed in order to maximize our global emission reductions. And this is not just about innovating to produce these solutions, which is, of course, one of the aspects that avoided emissions is promoting. It's also about ensuring that the existing solutions that we have already in the market are deployed in the right regions. And just to give you some examples of what these solutions can look like, we have already covered PV panels, which of course are avoiding emissions and decarbonizing society through grid decarbonization. But we have also other examples such as heat pumps, which are avoiding emissions through decarbonizing heat generation, which is of course one of the key challenges that we have nowadays within society, and also elements or services such as a ride-sharing app, which is avoiding emissions via reducing the number of cars that we have on the roads, and to essentially reducing the emissions associated to transport. But of course, if we start looking at the solutions and the increased awareness that climate change has experienced over the recent times, we see also that it has come accompanied with a surge in sustainable solution claims that we have seen, as explained by Dominic in his impulse speech. And of course, these claims, a lot of the times, do not necessarily follow the commonly accepted methodology. And quite frankly, sometimes you don't really know whether there's been a methodology at all. And of course, the result of this lack of transparency around the methodology or lack of consistency means that there's been a lot of controversies on the credibility of these claims. And again, referring back to the greenwashing that Dominic alluded to when it comes to understanding how these solutions are actually contributing to our global net zero. As such, we believe within WBCSD and in collaboration with Carbon Cat that there was a need to raise the bar of the current claims by giving companies the tools and the guidance that they need to understand how they can leverage and calculate avoided emissions to support and scale the solutions that are needed to reach net zero globally. And it is with this premise that we decided to create the guidance that we are launching today. And I will pass over to Cesar and to Diane, who will be guiding you through some of the more detailed aspects of the guidance in terms of what it contains and what we've tried to achieve with it. So over to you, Cesar.
Thank you very much, Cecilia. Everyone, hello. So as Dominic said earlier, it's really important to understand that the guidance focuses on a very specific indicator of climate action. So if we could go to the next slide, please. Thank you. So we are focusing on a very specific indicator of climate change, which is strictly separated from other metrics, such as carbon footprint or carbon removals, but it's also very complementary. So we know that to get to global net zero, we need to both reduce our emissions by 5 to 7% per year, and also preserve and increase our carbon sinks. To contribute fairly to this global goal, companies must activate 3 complementary and essential levers for action. So we already know the first one, which is pillar A, which is the way a company decarbonizes and needs to reduce its emissions by 90% before 2050, which is not the focus of the guidance. We know also on the right side of the screen that companies should also increase removals, which is not the purpose of the guidance, which will be covered by another guidance from the WRI with the GHG protocol on land and removals. So our guidance really focuses on pillar B, which is the company's contribution to global decarbonization, and especially through the introduction of solutions. Next slide, please. So what is covered by this guidance? First, we started our journey with the intention to define calculation rules to increase consistency of avoided emissions without reinventing the wheel. We really wanted to build on existing guidance, but also we wanted to codify reporting best practices to increase transparency and accountability. However, we quickly realized that we needed to go further than that to ensure that there was no misuse of avoided emissions. So what we did was incorporate 2 additional dimensions, which are the 3 eligibility criteria that Diane is going to talk to you very soon, that companies need to comply with before being able to make avoided emissions claims. And secondly, to provide guidance on how to strategically leverage avoided emissions in order in the transition of society to a net zero planet. Next slide, please. So very briefly, an avoided emission is the decarbonizing impact that a specific solution has when compared to a scenario where the solution would not have been used, which we call reference scenario. So this implies that avoided emissions are highly dependent on context. As Cecilia said, you don't have the same effect with selling solar panels in a region that mainly uses renewable energy versus a region where you have lots of fossil fuels. So this means that we need to establish robust and consistent guardrails to limit arbitrariness and to ensure that avoided emissions claims are truly contributing to our global net zero targets. And over to Diane on why and how to leverage avoided emissions.
Thank you, Cesar. So now let's step back a bit and understand indeed why leveraging avoided emissions is relevant for different types of stakeholders. So first, from a business perspective, business can use avoided emissions in three main ways to drive transition. First, businesses can use avoided emissions to identify innovation opportunities while maximizing their decarbonizing impact in the society. Businesses can also use avoided emissions to prioritize the scaling of solutions, as Cesar just said, in the markets where they will have highest impact. As we know, most of the solutions we need to reach global net zero are already existing, and our biggest challenge is to scale them. And finally, businesses can use avoided emissions to demonstrate their contribution to global net zero efforts beyond reducing their emissions. But as Dominic shared, avoided emissions are not just useful for businesses. It can also be used by other main actors you can see here on the page. First, avoided emissions can support investors to prioritize investments to companies or solutions with high decarbonizing impacts. Avoided emissions can also better inform consumers and drive demand for less carbon-intensive solutions. And finally, avoided emissions can support climate policy measures to incentivize development and scaling of decarbonizing solutions. And so we hope that with more consistency and robustness in avoided emissions claims, our guidance will support those stakeholders, investors, society, governments, and businesses to collectively use avoided emissions and accelerate global net zero efforts. Now, I'm going to share with you a key section of the guidance, eligibility gates. But first, why eligibility gates? When we started to write the guidance, we all had in mind the challenge of ensuring credibility of avoided emissions claims. The gates are designed for that purpose in order to provide companies a framework to check even before they are quantifying their avoided emissions, if avoided emissions is a relevant metric for them. To do so, we define three gates, one at company level, two at solution level. The first one is about climate action credibility. It requires to disclose a climate strategy aligned with latest climate science. It was developed really to ensure, regardless of the solution being provided, companies do not lose sight of the need to also reduce their own emissions. The second gate is focusing on the compatibility of the solution to 1.5-degree world. And finally, the last gate is about the contribution legitimacy. Does the solution have a direct and significant decarbonizing impact in the society? Of course, the guide provides details on how those gates can be justified and include references that can be leveraged to assess compliance, such as the IPCC or the EU taxonomy for Gate 2. I'm now going to hand over to Cesar, who will share with you the two last sections of the guidance.
Thank you very much, Diane. So on the next section, we would like to cover the calculation and reporting principles that we have developed in the guidance. So next slide, please. So how to assess avoided emissions? It's a 5-step process. The first step would be to identify the time frame and identify whether it is a year-on-year calculation or a forward-looking calculation. So year-on-year calculation is where you kind of track your product throughout its lifetime and assess avoided emissions every year. Forward-looking calculation is where all future avoided emissions are assessed at the year of sales. Second step, once you have done that, is to define the reference scenario, which is what is likely to have happened if the customer hadn't bought the solution. So it is really the core of the topic. It's really the most sensitive step here, because it highly depends on the context. It also depends on several parameters, including is the solution addressing a new demand or with a rebound effect associated to it, or an existing demand? If it's an existing demand, how was this demand previously met? By which product? Is it an improvement of an existing system or a replacement, and so on? And also, is there regulation put in place in the context of sales, etc.? Once you have done that, the third step is to assess the solution and reference scenario on the whole lifecycle emissions. The fourth step is to assess the avoided emissions, which is the difference between the solution scenario and the reference scenario. And then the fifth step, which is an optional step, is to consolidate avoided emissions at the scale of the company. But it's an optional step. Next slide, please. Once you have assessed your avoided emissions at the scale of products first and of the company, then you need, or you might want to report on your avoided emissions. So next slide, please. I will not going into detail of the recommendations, but maybe one very important point that we have put in place is that we require companies to disclose the share of revenues that generate avoided emissions. So it's a way to understand how much of the company's portfolio is really useful for the transition. We think that disclosing a total volume of avoided emissions by itself is not really interesting on its own. So what we need to look at is the share of sales that have generated such avoided emissions. And it's maybe even more important to understand the share of sales that do not avoid emissions. And that's it. So I think we could go to the next slide and hand over to Alex.
Thank you very much, Cecilia, Cesar, and Diane. I think that was very helpful to understand what we are looking here if we talk on avoided emissions. It is intervention accounting, so you have seen it is quite challenging. We look at additional contributions beyond scope 1, 2, and 3, and there's no netting feasible. So we really keep up the credibility. The guidance is the first edition, and obviously there's further opportunities to advance it, to take it to the next level, but this is the first edition you can now download and see. And now I'm handing back over to Cesar, who is going into short discussions with our advisory panel to see what their take is on where we landed so far. Cesar, over to you.
Thank you, Alex. So we have the great chance to have today two prominent members of our advisory group, Pernilla Bergmark and Greg Norris. So if Greg and Pernilla, are you with us? Yes, hello. So great to have you here. Thank you very much for your time and for being with us today. So I have several questions for you for the next 10 minutes. So could you maybe enlighten us on what to you are the main contributions of the guidance and what is the added value that you see on this guidance?
So who do you want to go first? Maybe you.
Or maybe you, Pernilla.
Okay, I start then. Yeah, so to me, I think a strong part of this guidance is really the strong focus on the eligibility criteria and to find a fair balance between giving the opportunity to put forward impacts potentials from solutions while not risking to or avoiding risks of greenwashing. I think that is a very strong element. And I think also that one of my favorite parts of the document is probably the pages towards the end. And why I think so is that in any kind of methodology, it's so important that it clearly states as much what it does not provide as what it provides. And I think you come out with a very clear description of limitations and so on. I think it's very, very important in this context.
Thank you, Pernilla. Greg, do you want to share your thoughts?
Yes, happy to briefly do so. So I think for me, two of the key strengths are its positioning of avoided emissions relative to reductions of one's own footprint, And secondly, the selection of a valid, realistic reference case, as you mentioned, Cesar, that can really be a pitfall. It can lead people to accidentally or intentionally greenwash. So establishing that was key. For me, the positioning in relation to footprint was done so well, both through the eligibility criteria that you mentioned, Pernilla, that this is about doing more than footprint reduction. It's an and, not an or. And that comes through also on the communication piece.
Thank you so much. So, Greg, let's continue with you. And maybe can I ask you to whom you would recommend reading this guidance?
You know, I just can't resist saying virtually all companies. And in those companies, I would say very much more than the sustainability people. Of course, our sustainability people should read it, but I'd love to see CFOs, CEOs, marketing departments, boards of directors, investors. They need to be asking companies, how is our business aligned with delivering solutions, and are we telling the market about that?
Pernilla?
Yeah, I think I can just agree that this type of framing there is a strong interest, of course, and we can see that from the participation today. Having this framework, which is in a sense complementary to some other frameworks that already exist, and especially by providing this framing, I think it's useful for anyone wanting to either make a statement or interpret a statement, of course, on avoided emissions.
Yeah, so fully agree with both of you that it could be great that not only the CSR side of companies read this guidance, and because it really looks into the strategy of the company. So fully agree. Pernilla, so I have a third and last question for both of you, which is a tricky one. What are the next steps that you would see for this guidance? What would you recommend in terms of next steps? Pernilla?
Yeah, I think it's a complicated topic altogether. So I think of course, this guidance provides great opportunities, but it also comes then with great responsibilities. So I think as we start using it, and you are also referring to this sort of gradual development of a methodology like this. So I think it will be important to watch out for loopholes and any unclarity and so on. But I think there are some things I think in relation to the how to quantify, that is probably one part where we will need more guidance moving forward, and we can see there are other initiatives which move perhaps more in that direction, such for ICT sector we have the ITU L1480. I think that the having this revenue share as a criteria, I think is a great starting point, but of course it's not obvious that emission potentials and emission risks are well aligned with the revenue. So that is something else that could be further studies in the future. And then of course, now we focus here on the avoided emissions, but there is also as you put forward in the document itself, the added emissions and to balance those and to understand those further. So I think it's an excellent starting point, and I also think we all acknowledge that this is a topic that will mature over the years, and we'll learn what kind of complements would be needed.
Thank you, Pernilla. Greg, what are your thoughts on the next steps that we should follow?
You know, I think especially right now, what we need is road testing of this guidance, and I see at least three kinds of road testing that I'd love to see happen. One is case studies that show how this change of incentives, where you add the avoided emissions reporting to the reduction of one's own footprint, how does this lead to encouraging new actions, new interventions from companies? How does it change the incentives there? And secondly, can we find some real cases where companies are doing things differently because of this new lens on their impacts and their reporting? Third, I'd like people to try to hack this guidance. You know, as you say, Pernilla, what about loopholes? If people can search for any greenwashing loopholes, ways that the guidance could be used to harm rather than help our collective efforts at meeting the climate challenge, that would be vital, because we can probably close those loopholes down and tighten it up, make sure that it's making a purely positive contribution.
Thank you so much for both of you. It was really valuable to have you today. And now I hand over to Alex for the next steps.
Thank you very much, Cesar. Thanks, Pernilla. Thanks, Greg. And also thanks to all the other members of the advisory board for supporting us, for guiding us throughout this process on the opportunities, on the risks, and also, as we just saw, on potential side effects, non-intended consequences that all need to take into consideration. So the last part of this webinar is now we are taking a look into how avoided emissions may be used, leveraged within finance as well as in politics. So it's a pleasure welcoming Tony to the stage, Executive Director and Head of Transition Finance at GFANZ. And Tony, please share with us, how do you see this concept or a KPI of avoided emissions might support financial institutions taking decisions, how you may use it in climate transition plans? So very much looking forward to see what your take is on avoided emissions.
Thanks, Alexander, and it's a great pleasure to be here today. I just want to contextualize some of my comments. As you said, Alexander, one of our key things that we did last year with financial institutions was help them understand what a net zero commitment means. And we published a framework for financial institutions to use to describe the actions they're going to take to help the economy decarbonize. And it's really in that point of helping the economy to decarbonize that's at the core of the transition plan for financial institutions. We also published expectations on information that financial institutions need to have from real economy companies, from corporates. And it follows the same framework of understanding what the goals are of the organization in their net zero, in their commitment to decarbonize, how they're implementing it, how they're engaging, what governance that they have, and then what metrics and targets. And it's in this latter area that I think avoided emissions is an area that could actually help financial institutions to understand when they're investing in companies or in particular projects, are they actually helping to decarbonize the economy? So if we move on to the next slide, I've spared you going through the whole of the framework, but if we deep dive into these metrics and targets, for financial institutions, we have 3 areas of metrics and targets. The activity and monitoring that they're doing in the real economy transition, the economy-wide transition. The metrics that they have on executing their transition plan, and the metrics and targets they have around the portfolio emissions, the financed emissions or insured emissions that they make. It's really in this real economy transition, again, as I said, I'm going to hammer it home, hopefully. This is an area where avoided emissions could help, because it's not just about the point in time emissions, it's what investing in climate solutions or into phase out of high carbon assets. It's those avoided emissions which will actually help financial institutions understand what is the impact of their investment. So it's really a part of a family of forward-looking metrics that can help the financial institution understand what their contribution in their transition plan will be to real economy decarbonization. And so if we move on to the next slide, just to sort of summarize, The transition plans themselves can help with those eligibility criteria. The avoided emissions calculation can be a useful metric in transition plans for those climate solutions and the managed phase out of high carbon assets, although primarily we've dealt with climate solutions. And just so you understand, this year is very much the year that we want at GFANZ to scale and implement these transition plans for financial institutions to do that, but also to encourage corporates to do this so that we can scale transition finance. The IPCC report this week, big wake up call, and we need to scale that transition finance to help decarbonize these in these tough areas that struggle to decarbonize or will find it difficult. So that's really part and parcel of some of the things that we're doing this year. And we know that this is also transition finance is high up on the G7 agenda as well. So transition plans form a component of that. And as I said, avoided emissions can be a useful metric. So that's a brief overview of where we see this potentially playing in the financial institution area. And as I said, transition finance for policy is going to be massive. And I think the IPCC report has just emphasized how fast that needs to go.
Thank you so much. It is great to see, like you're saying, it could play a useful metric in the transition. Thanks so much, Tony, for being with us.
Pleasure.
And seeing how this systems change can further advance if we feel that avoided emissions are a useful indicator, that they need some kind of support or incentives on the one side from finance. And now if we move on to the next slide, also from regulators and governments. So we have been very fortunate to be able to collaborate with the Ministry of Economy, Trade and Industry of the government of Japan. And we have Kihara-san, the Deputy Director General, with us on a video message that he kindly recorded this morning, as it's already evening times now in Japan. Thanks so much for your support, Kihara-san, and please let's listen and watch the short video.
I am Shinichi Kihara, Deputy Director General for Technology and Environment, Ministry of Economy, Trade and Industry of the Government of Japan. Congratulations on the release of the guidance on avoided emission. We have been working with the WBCSD to bring together the industry, financial sector, and government to discuss avoided emission at the Global Green Transformation Conference in Tokyo last October, the WBSD plenary meeting in Japan, and COP27 in Sharm el-Sheikh, Egypt. Our 1.5 degree target is a very ambitious goal. It is a target that can only be achieved if whole of economy at global scale take action. Also, to achieve this ambitious goal, we need a mechanism to facilitate both emission reductions and economic growth. In other words, climate action needs to be sustainable from business perspectives. Avoided emission has a role to play here as an effective mechanism that recognizes and maximizes the company's contribution to the society as solution provider. The mechanism will facilitate innovation and investment. However, at the same time, we need to ensure that avoided emission is used appropriately. Credibility of the mechanism is crucial. In this context, we are very pleased that guidance on avoided emission has now been published. I understand that this is an ongoing work and will be updated as it is used in practice. This year, Japan holds the presidency of G7. I am pleased that WBCSD's achievement on avoided emission is in hand with our presidency. Japan is a solution provider country itself, who contributes to the world with our innovative technologies. The government of Japan will continue to work with WBCSD towards the realization of secure and sustainable future of the world. Once again, big congratulations on today's publication. Thank you.
Thank you very much to Matti, to Kihara-san and the team behind it. This is much appreciated. So we are coming to the end of the allocated time. So let's move on for closing and next steps. We have said it, this is a first edition. So we welcome your comments, your feedback, and my team just mentioned that there are many great questions coming in already now. They try to answer as many right now here in the chat, but if not, we will also post a link to a type form where you can ask further questions or feedback or comment on also how to further take this guidance to the next level. Greg mentioned it, there needs to be some road testing. So we are currently with our WBCSD member companies in a piloting phase of really seeing how does it get applied? What is working there? What is supporting to this overall objective to support companies further unleash internal decision-making procedures to unleash further innovation for low carbon solutions and products that are aligned with 1.5 beyond the mitigation pathways, beyond SBTi targets, beyond what we have seen as Scope 1, Scope 2, and Scope 3. So it is an additional concept. We will further refine it. So there will be a second edition. We will see how we can make it more robust. This is a guidance. It is not a standard yet, but we hope with what we are bringing out today, it will already enormously help you on navigating the agenda of avoided emissions. Thanks to all who have been with us. Thanks to all the speakers, Pernilla, Gregory, Kihara-san, Tony, as well as our own teams. Thanks for joining us today, all of you out there. You can now download the guidance. Here's a cover page again. Please have a good read and hope you have a good day. Bye-bye and see you soon.